Behavioural economics on a post-it 17. Classic preference reversals. There's lots of different types of preference reversal that have been discovered over the years in behavioural economics. I'm going to talk about what I've called here classic preference reversals, which were, I think, the sort of, original prominent form of preference reversal. And I always associate this with, I think rightly, with the work of Paul Slovic and Sever Lichtenstein. Slovic and Lichtenstein, who produced classic papers on preference reversals in the late 1960s and early 1970s. These types of preference reversals are one of the most robust findings in the whole of the whole of economic literature, let alone behavioural economic literature. And it's something that I've worked on myself over the years as well. I've produced quite a few papers on different types of preference reversals, different types of preference reversals, but within the sort of classic preference reversal domain, so to speak. Now, as background, in standard economic theory, standard rational choice theory, it's assumed that people should show consistent preferences, irrespective of how those preferences are elicited. So if you provide people with, say, two goods or two services or two things, let's call them A and B, then if you ask people to choose between those two things, say they choose A over B in a direct choice, what's called a pairwise choice, then if you were to elicit the monetary values that they would place upon those two things, then they should place a higher money value upon A than they do on B, because they've chosen A over B. If you are asked to rank those two things, they should rank on a straight line, for example, A higher than B. So irrespective of the procedure that you use to elicit preferences, you should get a consistent preference ordering. That we sometimes don't, and I'll try to demonstrate this in a moment, that we sometimes get an inconsistent preference ordering with different elicitation procedures is called a violation of what's called procedural invariance. So procedural invariance, preferences should be invariant to the procedure. That's the assumption in standard economic theory. So let me just try to demonstrate classic preference reversals to you. I remember Paul Slovic did some of his early work in real scenarios in casinos in Las Vegas. But I'll present to you sort of a hypothetical one that I've constructed here, hopefully to get the point across. So just consider A here. Again, like in sort of some of the previous post-its, you can consider it to be a sort of a little lottery ticket. So imagine that A offers a 20% chance of winning £1,000 and an 80% chance of winning nothing at all. So the question for you would be, what is the maximum amount of money that you would be prepared to buy that lottery ticket for? What would you be prepared to buy that lottery? Have a think about that. What's the maximum you would be willing to pay? This is, while you're thinking about that, A is sometimes called in the literature, sometimes called actually the dollar bet, because a lot of this literature, most of this early literature was based out of America, and they use dollars rather than pounds. So you've got like smallish probability of winning quite a large monetary amount in dollars. So that was sometimes called the dollar bet. That's A. Right. Now, similarly, consider B instead. Forget about A, consider B. B offers a 90% chance of winning £222 and a 10% chance of winning nothing. What's the maximum amount of money you'd be willing to pay for that lottery ticket? Think about that. And while you're thinking about that, B is sometimes, in the literature, it's usually called the P bet, because it provides I put it in percentage terms here, but it provides a high probability of winning a kind of a low amount that you could have got from the dollar bet or from A. So that's sometimes called the P bet, but that's an aside. All right. So what's the maximum amount you'd be willing to pay for that bet B? Okay. Now, what Slovic and Lichtenstein and others over the years would hypothesize is that you would have been willing to pay more for A than you would have been willing to pay for B. Right? Maybe it didn't, but that's what the hypothesis would be. And in many experiments on preference reversals using different sort of gambles than these, that assumption does hold up in people's choices. Now imagine you're not asked to place a monetary value upon these two things. You're asked to choose between them directly, a pairwise choice. So you can either choose A, 20% chance of £1,000 in this case, 80% chance of nothing, or you can choose B, a 90% chance of £222 or a 10% chance of nothing. Now, what the preference reversal literature sort of hypothesizes is that people would be more likely to choose B in this instance rather than A. The P bet, high probability of winning a relatively lower amount over the dollar bet, lower probability of winning the high amount. That's why. So it hypothesizes that most people will choose B over A. So the hypothesis, I've not tested it out with these particular gambles, but the hypothesis would be that people would place a higher monetary value upon A than on B, but then yet choose B over A in a direct pairwise choice. Right? If you think about these two as well, I should have said this earlier perhaps, the two options should have a similar expected value in these types of preference reversal tests. So if you remember from previous post-its, you get the expected value just by multiplying the probability by the amount that you could win. So in this case, 0.2 times 1,000, right? And similarly here, 0.9 times 222, and you get a very similar expected value. So this should have similar expected values. Now, if people do place a higher monetary value upon A, but then choose B over A in a direct pairwise choice, that is a direct preference reversal. And these results, as I said at the beginning, do tend to stand up very robustly across preference reversal literature. You can get many as 90% of respondents directly reversing their preferences in those sorts of ways. And that's a fundamental challenge, isn't it, to assumptions in standard economic theory at least, because if people seem to prefer a different thing, depending on how you elicit their preferences, then we can't really be sure which preference is the most accurate one. Their preferences could be constructed during the task rather than them holding these deep underlying preferences within themselves. Right? Okay, so that is preference reversal. Possible explanation, just before I finish this post-it, this is a short video. The possible explanation is that when you ask people to value these things independently, they have nothing really to compare them with, the choices with. You just ask for a value, and they may therefore anchor, when you ask for a value, you may anchor upon the amount that they can win. Right? This is called scale compatibility. If you ask people their monetary value for a particular thing that has a monetary value attached to it, they may anchor upon the monetary value, the money amount that they can win. And if they do that in both of these two choices, these two options, you can obviously see that the amount that they can win is much higher than in A than it is in B. So they anchor on the 1,000, they anchor on the 222, and that might drive their willingness to pay up for A. But when you ask them to choose between the two options, they're more able to directly compare all the attributes of those options. So not just the £1,000 and the £222, but also them able to sort of better process the differences in the probabilities of winning these money amounts. Okay, so there we have it. Classic preference reversals, behavioural economics on a post-it, number 17.